Good afternoon, and what a great pleasure to be on the 10th edition of the Delphi Economic Forum. Also, what an honor to follow great European leadership after Paolo Gentiloni, Vivian Reding, and Anna Palacio on the previous panel, and we want to keep the same positive spirit and passion for EU responsiveness and readiness in this panel as well. Strategic responses to geopolitical shifts, investments, and EU autonomy. It's a heavy title, and I have to say that maybe 5 years ago, or even a shorter period of time, geopolitics was considered to be more of a backdrop rather than the center of discussion. But here we are today, that geopolitics is not only back, but it is shaping the very foundations of business, trade, and global cooperation. We would like to unpack this new reality with a distinguished panel of speakers, starting with Spilios Livanos, who is the chairman of the board of HELLENiQ Energy, largest energy player in the region. Manolis Sigalas, senior vice president and managing director of HELL International, global project management firm, US-based. Andreas Xirocostas, managing director for Cyprus, Malta, and Greece of SAP. And finally, my dear friend, old Delphi attendant, and also global leader of the BCG Henderson Institute, our own think tank, and vice chair of our Global Advantage practice, which started and is now shaping geopolitics, helping all of us in BCG, Nikolaus. Great to have you all. I would like to start with some opening thoughts with our thought leader on the topic, Nikolaus. Niki.
Yes, thank you very much, Vassilis. And you know, people are asking, where is the world heading? And I think I'd like to share with you a little bit of perspective of what I call the unbalanced multipolarity of 4 poles and the 3 biggest battlegrounds. So when we talk about the unbalanced multipolarity, I think there has been a lot of discussion that we moved from the 1990s and 2000s, where the world seemed to have only 1 pole, to a world that has multiple poles. I think today we have probably 4 or more poles in the world. The first pole is the one that keeps us busy and on our toes at the moment, is America. It's the question of whether it's America first or America alone. The reality is, I think what we clearly see is that the April 2nd tariffs, even if they have been paused, just show a tendency towards ever-increasing tariffication, which will at the end have a massive economic impact on the US economy. Just to give you a few facts, after April 2nd, and if these tariffs come, the tariff level in the US is at 22.8%, which is 10x of last year. This will have an effect of shaving off 2 percentage points of US GDP and will increase inflation by 2% to 5% in the US. So if that happens, US will be a recessionary, low growth, high inflation country. Then let's move on to China. I don't know who of you was at the Munich Security Conference, but one of the best things I had at the Munich Security Conference was actually not the speech by J.D. Vance, who all told us that we are anti-democratic and we have not freedom of speech. But what was actually interesting is that when you sat in the room as I did, and when Vice President Vance had finished his speech, 2/3 of the room left and 1/3 sat, and I think then the really interesting story started, because then came Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and he said, well, you know, ladies and gentlemen, you heard what the US said. We are open for business. We believe in multilateralism. So, you know, if you need some trading partners, here we are. And I think that's the reality we're seeing. The second pole is China, potentially with or not with Russia. And we have, the reality is that China is the #1 trading partner for 120 countries in this world. 120. Europe is the #1 trading partner for 60 countries in this world. And the US is the trading partner of 18 countries in the world. So what we will see is that probably China will profit of a big rebalancing of trade. And if China loses $200 billion in trade with the US, it'll be easily counterbalanced with $200 billion with Russia, $200 billion with Africa, $200 billion with Latin America. Second pole. Third pole, I think, is the global south. it's India that will play an important role. India will continue to grow by 6 to 8%, likely to be at $9 trillion GDP size by the end of this decade. Growing population. And we believe that India will be an important power on top of the global south players like Indonesia, Middle East, and so on. And then comes the fourth pole, which is Europe. And after the panel we've had, I'll be cautious in my opinion. But I think, going forward, I think my feeling is that Europe has had a lot of wake-up calls. I think it's like, I don't know how you are in your bed, you get the wake-up call, but you don't you don't really stand up. I think it's now a matter of Europe standing up and not only listening to the wake-up calls. I think the big challenge of Europe in the past, the biggest three mistakes of Europe, I think are well known. We outsourced energy to Russia, defense to US, and growth to China. So if you now go back and you take these three mistakes, we need to solve them. I think we need, on energy, to move from Russia to renewables. When it comes to growth, I think we need to move away from pure export to thinking about what we can do on AI, on innovation, on tech, and really kind of leverage what we have. And number three, I think when we talk about defense, it's about really making sure that we have a sovereign defense activity. And there I would like to quote the Chancellor Merz, who said, defense in Europe is all about three S: standardization, simplification, and scaling. And I think that's where we see the tendency. So these are the four poles. I think we see three battlegrounds today. We see a battleground on trade, which we all see every day. A little caveat here as well. We need to be aware that global trade is $22 trillion. And of those $22 trillion, only 4.5 trillion touch the US. So there is 80% of the world trade that is not touching the US, which we also need to take aware. I think then the second battleground is tech and AI. I think we'll talk about it later. I think it's fascinating to see the alternative Chinese approaches to generative AI when you see DeepSeek Qwen 2.5 versus the big money, the high-performance chips from the US. And the third battleground is industrial policies with Repower EU, Rearm EU, and many other tendencies going forward. So I think the future in which we are working is a multipolar world with a multiplicity of different battlegrounds.
Thank you, Nikki. And I think the scope of the panel will be primarily on the fourth pillar, which is Europe. But I want to take also all the three different aspects that you have mentioned. So let's start with the first one, which is around trade and energy that you have mentioned. And Spilio, I want to come to you and build on what Nikki said about the wake-up call for Europe, which is a wake-up call that we have heard in the previous panel, but also in many others around collaboration, but also around autonomy for the EU. And you come with a perspective of a leading energy player in our region. So I would like to hear your perspective around how can government and business collaborate better in order to limit the impact of future market disruptions, but also to maximize EU autonomy when it comes to energy.
Well, first of all, dear Vassilis, thank you for the invitation, and thank you to BCG for including us in a panel with such distinguished speakers, and also talking for such an interesting topic. It's interesting that we are just following the commissioners. They were very energetic in saying that we can do it. I believe that we might have some, not differences, but we might bring up some issues for them, and it's a pity they're not here to listen to us. Coming back to what Nikki was saying about America first or America alone, it's obvious that in the past few days, what we've been bluntly revealed in front of us is that we live in a world of geopolitical turmoil and economic uncertainty, and that's for sure. And the US decided to do that by changing the rules of the global international trade game. The consequences for that American decision have already affected stock markets that we've seen, and commodity prices. In our spectrum, for example, we had a big, it's a good example, we had a big loss in the crude oil prices. We also experienced a huge volatility in the stock markets, and also we had the bonds falling down in the States, and maybe that was the reason that we had a change of policy announced yesterday. In general, though, going back, tariffs, trade barriers, sanctions have always negative, substantial negative effects to markets and to energy markets. We saw that in the war in the Ukraine. We saw that when the first 10% tariffs were imposed to Canada, and I guess we will see it in the near future. I'm not sure whether this US policy really aims to shift global geopolitical balances, or if it's simply, and maybe you going around to many panels, maybe you have more insight in that, if it's just a misguided, risky economics decision, and that remains to be seen. The implementation of this policy, however, clearly shows that our world, as you implied, is getting into a recession. And let's hope that the redirection that we saw yesterday is going to be the new path, and we won't suffer a lot. In any case, all our businesses, but also states and the European Union itself, we must prepare for the worst case scenario. And having said that, especially for the EU, a huge player, obviously, as you implied, but a major importer of energy products, without having secure access to affordable energy in Europe, we will suffer. And we will suffer in a twofold way, because disruption costs flow throughout the value chain as well, and that's a huge problem for us. In Hellenic Energy, it is clear that we have, our position is that Europe needs to reshape its energy landscape. It's a strategic necessity to maintain our competitiveness and our sustainability. The key word, as you said, Vassilis, in the beginning, I believe is collaboration. We need industries, governments, and the EU, the executive branch, to work together. At the same time, we need the US government work together with the people in Brussels, and also with national governments. We heard Prime Minister Mitsotakis, I think, was on the right track yesterday, talking about win-win negotiations, and maybe him knowing quite well the general spectrum, maybe that's a way for Europe to go and work together with the Trump administration. Now, I don't know how much time I have.
Not 1 minute.
Okay, the European Commission and the European Council need to decide and implement, we had discussions about that previously during the day, major strategic infrastructure investments. And what do I mean by that? Pipelines, storage facilities, local and international grids, electricity interconnectors. In this morning, we heard the ministers of 3 states of the region talking about that. It's huge. That has to go on the top level of the European agenda, and not only in terms of talking. We have to, I mean, Europe, the executive branch has to include permitting, financing, facilitation. They have to expedite on PPCs, on PPPs. They have to look at grants and loans. Otherwise, Europe will stay behind.
maybe it would help a lot to get the perspective also of Andreas, and thank you very much, Spilio, to get the perspective of Andreas Xirocostas. When we were preparing and I was saying Europe doesn't have its own technology giants, the GAFAs, etc., he kept reminding me that there is SAP, which is the largest market cap in Europe. I haven't checked the latest stock market. I don't these days because it's bad for my health. But I assume that it is up there. I hope it is. But the role of technology in countries like Greece, but also for Europe, since we're talking about European autonomy, in helping us remain competitive.
So first of all, in times like this, I believe that we have more questions than answers. And maybe we have to take advantage of the oracle of Delphi in order to get something more tangible. What we can say right now is that, let's be frank, Europe is not the pioneer in technology. Okay? We have great dependencies. When it comes to infrastructure, the big hyperscalers are, all of them, not European, to put it this way. At the same time, if you check the technology that comes to every single person is not European as well. And if you take into account that right now the technology goes to cloud, you can understand that the general availability of technology is an assumption right now. I hope, because I'm coming from a company that creates technology, and I would like to stay away from any political discussion. I'm not here to... I have my own opinion, but it's not of interest. But I hope that the technology that makes people's life better will stay out of this power rivalry. I don't want to think what will happen if we enter to, let's say, a block of technology transfer, which exists, of course, at the cutting edge, which is expected, but not to the extent to create problems to other not countries, I say communities. So, especially for Greece, I believe that technology was fundamental, and the technology played a decisive role in exiting the crisis. I don't know how known it is, but Greece had made significant steps. And by the way, the RRF was very, very crucial to this direction. I can say from my experience that the average of the technology acumen right now in Greece is not so low compared to the European standards. In Greece, we are a little bit introvert. We tend to say only the bad things, but there's a good side right now for Greece. And I believe that this is reflected also at the numbers. You cannot have, at this point in time, just a growth out of consumption. And by the way, I believe this is something that we have to revise in Greece, also after the latest developments. It's a low-hanging fruit, I understand, but we have to understand that in some cases you have to be so good that they can ignore you. And technology is the area that you can be, nobody can ignore you if you are very good. So I believe that, yes, we have to revise our model and diversify instead of going to the low-hanging fruit, which of course is tourism, to something that it is compatible with tourism and it is technology. So instead of having, let's say, more tourists, maybe we can attract people working at the technology area as well.
Thank you. And Manoli, also defense is a big part when we talk about EU industry and also EU autonomy. So if you can help us a little bit on how defense-driven projects will help in that aspect, and also if we talk about EU strategic autonomy, we cannot have Ukraine out of the question as well. So if you can comment on this as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Vassili, and the BCG team for the opportunity to join your panel. Indeed, just a few weeks ago, the Commission unveiled a white paper regarding called European Defense Readiness 2030. As a side note, for all of us civilians, this paper includes some overwhelming statements and remarks regarding the perceived threat of a wide-scale war in the future. Notwithstanding, a key pillar and a key objective of the European Defence Plan going forward will be to support the investments in dual-use transportation mobility. Specifically, a pan-European network of airports, ports, railway, motorways, and associated logistics infrastructure, of course, including existing infrastructure assets that will need to be revamped and upgraded for the future, to facilitate the wide-scale and rapid deployment, not just of civilians and trade, as we currently know it, but explicitly for troops and army and heavy military equipment. Now, as shocking as this may sound, this is the new reality. This is the current direction, strategic direction of the EU. And whilst the details of the plan are yet to be formulated in terms of the specific project pipeline into that program, we anticipate that it will have an impact on the way the projects are screened to secure funding at the EU level, but also institutional changes and regulatory changes aimed towards facilitating the implementation of that program, of those projects from a programmatic perspective. Notably, the European Court of Auditors also issued a report recently overviewing and assessing the current plan of Europe in this respect, the so-called Action Mobility 2.0, and amongst its various findings, one of the key weaknesses that it identifies is the lack of funding, complete lack of funding, for projects relating to the South Corridor to Ukraine. And this relates also to our region because it's Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova, Ukraine. And putting it in a practical context, and I'm not a military expert, but in reality is how heavy military equipment or a tank land at the port of Alexandroupolis, and they need to advance northbound all the way to the borders and to Ukraine. That's a practical problem to solve. Now, in this context, Europe's mobility network will need to extend to Ukraine. I was in Kiev last week. Of course, Ukraine faces a much larger reconstruction program than that. World Bank updated estimate is an astounding $500 billion, 524 billion US for at least the next decade. But even if one considers the subset of immediate needs and medium-term needs, underscores a necessity that it is needed on the ground, which is capacity. And for the reconstruction program of Ukraine, without going off on a tangent to succeed, of course, capacity building will be key. Capacity of the state at the national and regional levels, but also scaling up the absorption capacity of the private sector to cope with increased scope. And to this end, the technical assistance programs and the PPF, Project Preparation Facilities Program of the World Bank and of EIB are critical for success to propel the program going forward, not least in order to instill confidence and laying the foundations for the long term, for attracting private capital and foreign direct investments in the long term. And no doubt, this is going to be a process.
Thank you, Manolis. So I'm hearing on the infrastructure side, as Spilios said, need for collaboration for large infrastructure projects in energy and beyond. I hear from Andreas that there is need on the technology front to make it a catalyst for helping Europe not only keep its talent, but attract talent and make this a true enabler across industry. And what I hear from Manolis Sigalas is that the need for defense-related work, starting from mobility, but also ranging across, is quite significant. One aspect that we have not discussed at all is green transition, where it's the one area that Europe, at least from a regulatory perspective, everybody agrees that it had gone too far. Some people will say best practice, some people will say a bit to an excess. But it is something that we have heard a lot today in Delphi, that there is a need to stay the course. So the question, again, starting with Spilios, is to what extent Europe can maintain its focus on the net zero goals, and the example of HELLENiQ Energy as a leading energy player would be very interesting to hear. but in a way that also doesn't sacrifice competitiveness for EU industry?
Yeah, thank you. Well, let me start by saying that Europe basically is a front runner in that respect. Although it accounts only about 7% of the CO2 emissions, it has been pushing really strong in decarbonization policies. We had projects like the Net Zero, the EU Green Deal, the Fit for 55 package, and this was very, very strong, and it characterized the Brussels policy throughout these years. Yet during the same time, we had the energy cost rising incredibly throughout these years, and we had a result of having about, in a medium number throughout Europe, 50% higher prices than we had 10 years ago. And obviously that has a consequence on competitiveness, which suffered, and we have been stagnant in industrial production since the year 2018, which is crucial for the future of Europe. In the same time, let's see what was happening in our societies. People around Europe turned their backs to the traditional political parties. They turned their backs to the lasting stability that we had in the European Union, and actually turned to populism. We can understand that what populism may bring to the European societies, that we cannot really see it coming. I mean, people that vote cannot really see it coming. And we can also understand in this room that all social unrest create problems in investing, in investors coming to Europe, and actually in creating bigger economic scales. Let me just say that in energy, we're learning to say that there is an energy trilemma. It's availability, sustainability, and affordability of energy supply. In order to achieve that, we need at least the following year a more balanced approach. And that is a good balance between industrialization, going forth with the help of digital, of other ideas, and at the same time balancing with energy transition. And we see that in the EU competitiveness compass, we have an opening towards this direction. It addresses availability and affordability. But we need further more measures to come in that way in order to support the existence of European industry. Let me give you an example from our part of the world. There is a project now in Europe, the Clean Industrial Deal, and the fuel manufacturing is excluded out of that. And that puts energy security and our industrial competitiveness at risk. I firmly believe that this decision must fastly change in Brussels, and maybe the executive branch there might think to start a program like the one in defense in order to put more energy in the energy sector. Now, regarding to the energy mix, that is the conversation that we've been listening to, we must never forget the time, the level of commitment, and basically the cost of investment needed in order to change the energy mix. And also, let us not forget in Europe that the way everybody sees now the energy sector, hydrocarbons are still here to stay for another 30 or 40 years, balancing out with the green investments. if the EU wants this transition to be viable, and if we need to get to some real targets, then we must consider a gradual path in that way in order to support liquid fuels and the underlying industry.
Since we are running out of time, sorry to interrupt you, Spilio, what I hear is that, please.
Just one word for our company. That's what the executive branch that is here in our company decided to do a few years ago with the Vision 25 project. We were very successful in that, and maybe that's a good example for other Europeans to follow.
And I hear that there need to be also some more reason behind the speed and also the regulation behind green transition at the EU side. Manoli, we need to go on the 2-minute mode for the closing of the panel on some thoughts around the scaling of the clean energy systems for Europe, but 2 minutes, please. And then I want to deep dive a little bit, not deep dive, but just to touch a little bit more on the technology side that I don't think we covered extensively.
Absolutely, Vassilis. Now, regarding scaling up energy projects, an inherent challenge that we all recognize is the fact that these major capital expenditure programs, particularly those requiring cross-border collaboration, require time. And of course, there may be recommendations and action plans on how to streamline the execution roadmap. There are some such recommendations in the Draghi report. I'm a bit skeptical as to how effective they can be in practice, given the realities of Europe at the country level and with the permitting regimes of each country and so forth. Accordingly, the EU needs investors such as HELLENiQ Energy and other players who are long-term investors, who know their space, are in a position to conceive and nurture and proceed with larger capital expenditure programs. Echoing the points that were made, we talk about energy security. However, projects such as FSRU in Alexandroupolis, Gdansk, are, of course, critical infrastructure projects that help diversify the supply routes and the suppliers, but in their own right, in their own merit, they don't warrant independence. And of course, the issue about hydrocarbons, zooming into our region, the Eastern Mediterranean, and we have successful examples in Israel and in Egypt, producing and exporting gas, and unfortunately, yet the European countries importing it. And the HELLENiQ power company for exploiting hydrocarbons and energy resources, I understand it was established in 2011. Fast forward today, 15 years with concessions, etc., still Greece's revenues from exploiting hydrocarbons are essentially non-existent. I'm citing this constructively as to what we can do to move things forward and yield benefits for the economy. Now, opportunities, of course, is completing and augmenting the energy transmission infrastructure, the interconnectors that were said, gas and electricity, battery storage, green hydrogen, and so forth. There are more than 160 projects of common interest to be implemented. Unfortunately, for right or wrong reasons, the EU, by way of the updating the regulation for the trans-European networks, has withdrawn the support for fossil infrastructure.
Thank you, Manoli. I want to conclude with the closing thoughts of Niki and then Andreas around the role of the EU on the digital frontier and what we can do in order to help on EU autonomy from an infrastructure, industrial, defense perspective, etc. Because, as Andreas said, we are not the most competitive power, to say it mildly, on the technology front. But what do you think is the way forward for the EU?
Yeah, so I think on technology going forward, we mentioned it at the beginning. I think we see a big, of course, tech and AI race. We see two big superpowers when it comes to generative AI, which is obviously US and China. I think that the EU has a right to play, but it really needs to get coordinated. Yeah, EU has, for example, the second largest pool of AI specialists on the globe, with 275,000 AI specialists. EU has the largest pool of AI IP and AI citations. And we have also, of course, players like Mistral and others who can play a role if they are really kind of embedded in an investment and capital situation, which is, should be similar to the US. So from my point of view, I think the battle is not over, but we need to get the act together. We need to really get the collaboration together, because each country by itself will not work. I think in France on February 11 and 12, Mr. Macron said we need the Airbus of AI. So I think it's a good image. And maybe just last anecdote, you know that Google DeepMind was made in UK and then went to the US. I think if there's one positive thing with the overall politics in the US, is that we have a surge of academic applications in Europe, while those in US are dropping. I'm not saying that in a cynical way, I'm saying that in a very kind of serious way, that there's a comparative advantage for IP development in Europe that is growing by the day, and we should leverage this.
And it can go beyond academia into more practical and commercial
Of course,
use.
like academia and then into commercial. But I think tech needs this interaction between, especially when we talk about AI and generative AI, the biggest advancement is always between leading universities and the tech ecosystem and money. You need universities, you need the big kind of capital, and then the entrepreneurship.
Last thoughts from Andreas.
Yes, I totally agree. First of all, we have to change what is usual right now when we have a great talent. That great talent has the dream to go to US, to continue his career and deliver the results of his competence. This is something that we have to try to change. We have to keep our talents in Europe. I truly believe that the battle of AI will be decisive. That's why we see a lot of movement around AI. We cannot stay as consumers, because as a consumer, you get the benefit of using the tool. Right now, I believe we have to create our own technology. And at the same time, I believe that Europe should proceed to this discussion, in brackets, with its own qualities. We should not imitate. We can never become US. So Europe is Europe. Culture and whatever has to do with, let's say, the intangible values of life is something that was always the characteristic of Europe. And I believe that technology can be a part of this journey.
Which is a very optimistic way to close the panel. It should be values-based, which is what differentiates Europe. I think the quality is there. If we hear that academic citations related to AI are increasing in Europe and not so in the US, but there is also a tough reality that calls for more realism at the EU level. There is a lot that has to be done, and it can only be done in a collaborative way, which is the spirit that we also built on this panel, taking from the other panels as well. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to discuss all together, and thank you very much for the full room.